Hi everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to another episode of Lines in Sand. Today we'll be returning to Keith Hamilton's Layman's Guide to the Great Pyramid, a fantastic two-part document filled to the brim with amazing facts and references about the Great Pyramid of Giza, and today I'm going to share them with you using Keith's excellent work as a guide. Just a quick reminder before we start that this is part 2 of 2 in the series utilising Keith's Layman's Guide, and whilst you don't lose out on anything by not watching these videos in order, if you're a new viewer, please be aware that we'll only be covering facts on certain parts of the pyramid in this video, as the rest was covered in part 1. In part 1 we covered the exterior of the pyramid, the main tunnel systems, the subterranean chamber and the grand gallery. We will be covering all the remaining elements of the Great Pyramid in this second video. So if you want the ultimate breakdown of the entire Great Pyramid, maybe start at the very beginning of part 1 and work your way through. Otherwise, this is going to be a very long video, so let's get stuck in and let's continue to take a look at the amazing interior of the Great Pyramid. The Well Shaft. Last episode we finished up by talking about the incredible Grand Gallery. This is one of the most visually impressive chambers within the Great Pyramid, but hidden at its northernmost end, right by the exit from the ascending passage, is the Well Shaft. Hamilton opens up this section all guns blazing, stating that the Well Shaft is a sea of confusion and that the available data about its makeup is, quote, poor and conflicting. Hamilton points to Benoit de Maillet, whose accounts of the Well Shaft are some of the earliest known, with his observations entitled Description de l'Egypte being published in 1735. Much earlier than this, however, is the fascinating fact that Pliny the Elder, writing as far back as the 1st century AD, wrote that inside the Great Pyramid a well can be found that is 38 meters deep in modern measurements. Also before the accounts of Benoit de Maillet are that of John Greaves, but the information within his accounts is based on slightly shakier ground. From John Greaves' work Pyramidographia, published in 1646, Professor Greaves writes,
"At the end of it, on the right hand, is the well mentioned by Pliny, which is circular as the Arabian writers describe. The diameter of it exceeds 3 feet. The sides are lined with white marble, and the descent into it is by fastening the hands and feet in little open spaces cut in the sides within, opposite and answerable to one another perpendicular."
Greaves goes on to say that he lit some material on fire and threw it down the well shaft in an attempt to ascertain a rough idea of how deep it went, only to find that the shaft was blocked with debris. It is, however, unclear at what depth the well shaft was blocked, at least from Greaves' account. Now, remember just a moment ago I said that Hamilton's opening lines of frustration with the inconsistency of the written accounts about the well shaft. The Edgar brothers, who we talked about quite a bit in part 1 of this series, wrote in their paper, Great Pyramid Passages Volume 1, that the well shaft is a square opening, not a circular one as Greaves states, and is also 28 inches in diameter, again contradicting Greaves, who proposed that the diameter was 36 inches. One does wonder how Greaves came to his observations and measurements, as going back to Benoit de Maillet, he also wrote in Description de l'Egypte that the well shaft is square, not circular, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to apologise for my pronunciation of certain French names. I'm sure they leave a lot to be desired. So what does the well shaft look like? Hamilton breaks down the shaft into 4 distinct sections, starting with the topmost vertical section that is 25 feet deep. This is the square in bore opening that the previous accounts we discussed describe, and the one that Greaves somehow perceived as circular. Hamilton states that the well shaft construction is uniform within the core masonry of the pyramid. After this first 25-foot section, that's just under 8 meters deep, the shaft inclines somewhat towards the south. Here it goes on in a more irregular fashion for nearly another 8 meters deep. The shaft then returns to a sheer vertical descent for the next 5.2 meters, and this is where we can find the mysterious and incredibly interesting hollow that is called the grotto. But we will come back to this cavity in a moment. Continuing down the well shaft, the material of the shaft gives way, and there is a transition from pyramid masonry. The tunnel now starts to become carved out of the actual bedrock beneath the Great Pyramid itself. The next section is the longest in the shaft, and also the most horribly claustrophobic, with a reported 30 inches in average height between the inclined floor and the ceiling in this portion. With the tunnel edging towards the south once more, it then runs deep underground for 26.5 meters in this cramped nature, where the amble south sharply turns steep again for an additional 9.5 meters, which is the final stretch before the well shaft meets an opening at the bottom of the descending passage, not far from the entrance to the Subterranean Chamber, deep in the bedrock beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza. Hamilton reminds us that the irregular route that the well shaft takes makes it very difficult to measure, but that the Edgar brothers clocked up the total descent as being 61 meters long. As you can probably imagine, just from the conflicting information in some of the accounts on the well shaft, the purpose of its construction has also been widely debated. In fact, we've even covered a few ideas here on the channel over the last few months, and you can find a glut of videos, including those by far more respectable YouTube creators who have addressed the well shaft's purpose in more detail. I will link some of these videos in the description below should you wish to explore some of these videos further. Anyway, let's talk about the mysterious grotto that can be found within the well shaft. Benoit de Maillet described a square window which allowed one to exit the well shaft and enter a secret grotto. Oddly, Maillet reports that the grotto appeared to consist of gravel bonded together rather than appearing to be an opening in natural rock. This gives me the impression, at least, that the grotto was possibly a man-made creation. But again, we loop back around to the same question as we had for the well shaft itself. Why? Hamilton very smartly points out that Maillet's account indicates that the grotto had already been breached in or before 1735. He proposes that the debris that filled the well shaft could well have been, no pun intended, the debris excavated from within the grotto, as explorers dug further into the cavity. It is interesting, however, that John Greaves does not mention the grotto in his account from the 1600s, but this may be because the well shaft was reported as blocked during this time, and he simply did not go down far enough, perhaps, to find the grotto. We turn now slightly later in history to the accounts of Robert Walpole, who published in 1817 some of the journals of explorer Nathaniel Davison, who supposedly explored the pyramids in 1763. Hamilton states that, armed with a lantern and a length of rope, Davison entered the well shaft. His account of the shaft seems confusing, so I won't repeat it here verbatim in order not to muddy the waters any further, but from his writing we can ascertain that he did find the main well shaft to be blocked after a certain ways, further towards the bottom where it nears the descending passageway it seems, but he was also able to enter the grotto and provide similar measurements for its size and construction as Benoit de Maillet did. This brings us up to the times of Caviglia, who also in 1817, the year of Walpole's publication, cleared the debris from the descending passage, as we covered in part 1 of this series. Caviglia is also credited for, in the act of clearing the descending passageway, discovering the opening at the bottom of the well shaft. He then cleared out all of the sand and rubbish that Benoit de Millet and Nathaniel Davidson had once stood on, unable to descend any further. And there, it seems, the shaft sits to this day, cleared but mostly unexplored, and of course completely off limits to tourists and other visitors of the Great Pyramid. It remains shrouded mostly in mystery and is well overdue for further exploration. For example, Hamilton points out that there are two conflicting views around the construction of the upper portions of the well shaft. Was the shaft built into the pyramid masonry, or was the shaft cut through pre-existing laid pyramid masonry? The French architect Gilles Domion, who has many excellent theories on the Great Pyramid, suggested that the well shaft only originally existed as far down as the mysterious grotto, but was then extended at a later date. We spoke in part 1 of this series about the ascending passageway into the Grand Gallery and how perhaps a series of portcullises was originally intended to block off access to the gallery and King's Chamber, and that this was abandoned in favour of sliding granite plugstones down the ascending passageway to block it off. Domion states that in this change of plan, an alternative escape route would be required for workers inside the Great Pyramid, and thus the well shaft was later crudely extended past the grotto all the way down to the bottom of the descending passageway where it terminates today. This all sounds well and good, but Hamilton is quick to point out that Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner wrote that there is evidence that the subterranean chamber came after the rest of the pyramid. So if this is the case, where on earth was the well shaft going? I share Hamilton's frustration with the data available on analysing the pyramid's well shaft. Domion's portcullis suggestion can also be called into question, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, returning to the construction method of the upper portion of the well shaft, Gilles Domion stated,
Similarly, the entire upper part of the shaft, which connects the north landing of the Grand Gallery to the grotto, was dug through masonry already in place. There is a general agreement on this point, which is beyond doubt.
However, Mariolio and Rinaldi in 2006 wrote,
The space for the upper part of this shaft was left in the pyramid masonry under construction. It descends vertically for a good distance through the nucleus masonry. At a certain point it becomes irregular, bends to the south, the resulting inclined part being cut out of the nucleus masonry, then penetrating the rock core of the pyramid above the level of the foundation pavement, opens in a so-called grotto.
Flinders Petrie would also comment on the well shaft, indicating he believed it to be carved out of the pre-existing masonry. The Edgar brothers also seemed in agreement for the most part, but indicate again that the very top section of the shaft does not appear quote-unquote tortuous and is uniformly square in bore and gives off the appearance of being constructed rather than dug through pre-existing masonry. So there we have it again. It is somewhat difficult to put a pin in the construction method of the well shaft, at least the topmost portion. Before we pontificate further on the contradictory elements of the well shaft, however, let's take another quick look inside the so-called grotto. Keith Hamilton shows us lots of wonderful photographs from within and diagrams of the grotto, all taken from, I believe, the Edgar brothers' accounts. In this diagram shown on screen, we can see a large granite slab accounted for in the drawing. We touched upon the locations of various random granite slabs within the Great Pyramid in part 1 of this series. Hamilton suggests that the slab may have been placed in the grotto by very early guides who tried to dissuade explorers in these areas, much in the same way that the descending passageway was once blocked with sand where it met Al-Mamun's tunnel, as we also covered in part 1. It is interesting to think what the purpose of this grotto was for, either in its use and in its construction, which is a big mystery, just like the well shaft itself. Why are there bends in the path of the well shaft also, for instance? For example, Hamilton writes, quote, The bend or bends may have been deliberately placed to arrest or slow down any falling objects, be it workers or masonry, etc. A worker losing their foothold might be thankful for such a feature, as it could arrest their slide. As I said earlier, the well shaft is currently completely closed to visitors of the Great Pyramid. Currently, a metal grate of sorts covers the hole where the well shaft began in the Grand Gallery. There is often told a story of a covering stone or blocking stone which once filled the entrance to the well shaft where the metal grate is now, but Hamilton believes that this may have never existed, much like the prophesied covering stone to the bottom side of the granite plugs that we can see in the ascending/descending passageway junction area. The general consensus is that the well shaft is how the final workers escaped from the inner workings of the Great Pyramid after sealing the ascending passage, and that in leaving via the well shaft, they sealed it to shut behind them with such a covering stone to hide the well shaft from the Grand Gallery and seal the pyramid's interior forever. Let's think for a moment here. Once inside this awkward space at the top of the well shaft where the cutting in goes across horizontally for a moment before the descent begins, how on earth would the workers be able to leverage such a huge covering stone into place from such a cramped and awkward space? Also, let's say that they were able to block the well shaft this way, okay? How would the well shaft also be blocked at the bottom? If it was left in this state with just the topmost covering stone and no blockages within the well shaft, thieves or explorers would have eventually just climbed the well shaft from the bottom up and would have, with time I'm sure, worked their way through destroying any covering stone, and then the Grand Gallery and King's Chamber would be theirs for the taking, as it were. No, something about these theories just doesn't quite sit right. Another thing to consider is where would such a massive covering stone fit, especially if you consider that the Grand Gallery was perhaps once filled with granite blocks, ready to slide on down the ascending passage once released. Where would there be room for such a covering stone of its dimensions that would not interfere with this setup? Hamilton does suggest that there could have been a series of smaller blocks used to plug up the entrance to the well, that these could have been carried easily up the well shaft from the bottom, but as far as I know, there is no evidence present that this was ever the case. Closing out this section, Hamilton writes in detail that he believed the well shaft to have two purposes. The first purpose is that the well shaft helped, quote, orientate and align, end quote, the pyramid's passageways, and the second purpose was as a service shaft for those left inside the pyramid to seal the ascending passageway. Hamilton agrees with Zahi Hawass and Mark Layman in their theory that the Subterranean Chamber came after the rest of the Great Pyramid's construction, and that the chamber's existence shouldn't factor into any theories about the well shaft. In accepting this, Hamilton asks, and I quote, "Then why was the well shaft constructed? As Petrie and others have remarked, the accuracy of the descending passage is quite impressive, with its azimuth mirroring that of the pyramid itself. Much ink has been spilt on the various methods employed on how they orientated these pyramid giants, but I do not think it unreasonable that the descending passage was accurately aligned to something in the night sky in order to maintain its accuracy." Hamilton states that many astronomers have put forward theories of this nature, pointing specifically to David Lightbody, who in turn pointed to the so-called pyramid trial passages as an example of how these stars could have assisted in pyramid alignment. Lightbody wrote, and this is a mouthful of a title, quote, "Moving heaven and earth for Khufu. Were the trial passages at Giza components of a rudimentary observatory? Question mark. End quote. That's the title of his paper. He wrote that in 2020, which is recommended as further reading should anyone be interested in this theory. Anyway, Let's get stuck into the main chambers of the Great Pyramid, as there is a lot to get through here, and I am excited to start dissecting these chambers, starting with the Queen's Chamber and the horizontal passage to the Queen's Chamber. The horizontal passage into the Queen's Chamber may not look particularly exciting on first glance. It is, after all, a straight corridor. It conforms to the corridor sizings of 2 cubits wide that the other tunnels in the pyramid conform to, and it goes in a straight line right the way down to the Queen's Chamber. That's it, right? Nope. You can see in this diagram from Gilles Domion the unusual layout of the masonry used in constructing this tunnel. Why is it so higgledy-piggledy? On top of this, it appears that it was originally completely coated in some sort of salt deposit that made investigating the masonry much more difficult. Piazzi Smith wrote,
Further, it is particularly noteworthy that in going from north to south in the horizontal passage, saline incrustations are observable on walls and floor beginning at about 150 to 200 distance from the north end and increasing in amount farther southward, until at last both roof, walls and floor are covered with a coating of them near an inch thick, brown outside with white inside, and almost a stony hardness, and they are termed by some authors spari excrescensis.
The Edgar brothers also noticed this unusual masonry as shown here in the later diagram by Domion, and they made detailed measurements of such. You may however notice differences between Edgar's diagrams and Domion's later diagrams, and this can be attributed once again to the salt covering the wall that made inspecting the joints almost impossible in places. The unusual masonry in this area, as Hamilton rightly notices, does run against the usual passageway construction convention. The material of which the stone floor of the tunnel is made of is also different to the passageways that run through the rest of the pyramid. Piazzi Smith would write about holes in the floor, indicating a poorer quality stone used than usual. He also noted that the walls of the Queen's Chamber passage appear to rest on the floor stones. In fact, the whole subject of flooring in the Queen's Chamber area is a cause for concern. In the chamber itself, the floor is rough and unfinished, and the floor level of the Queen's Chamber itself drops down from that of the passageway, as can be seen in the photo that is currently on screen. Flinders Petrie maintained the opinion that the flooring stones in the Queen's Chamber were never laid, and that the chamber has always had this drop from the corridor into the room itself. Others opine various theories that the flooring was removed or destroyed or merely used elsewhere in the pyramid, but there is no evidence, to my knowledge, for any of this. There is also no evidence for Petrie to truly declare that there was never any floor placed down, but Hamilton writes that if a floor was placed, it was likely to have been made from limestone, rather than the granite floor slabs of the King's Chamber. Going back to the horizontal passageway a moment, one can see in the above photo from Keith's guide several pipes protruding from the west wall of the passageway. I will quote Keith verbatim here because what he writes is extremely interesting. These holes were drilled by a French team in 1986 to help answer some anomalies picked up by a microgravimeter survey. Unfortunately, I could not find any detailed data on the above drilling. Some online articles suggest that 2 of the holes just drilled through masonry, whilst the third drilled into a sand cavity after a depth of 2.6 meters. In the following year, a Japanese team undertook a non-destructive survey of the passage, which seemed to indicate cavities. They also analysed the sand found in the cavity. This sand appears unusual in that it appears to be not locally sourced, but instead may have come as far away as the Sinai Peninsula. This sand is described as almost 100% quartz sand of a large grain size. Now, these cavities filled with sand that run alongside the Queen's Chamber passageway are very, very interesting to me. However, what its purpose is or was is still a mystery to me. Why is the cavity or cavities filled with quartz sand brought from a land that is approximately 180 miles away on the other side of the Nile? Hamilton writes that, of course, the Egyptians, of all people, would be experts in the properties of various forms of sand, and it does seem that this particular quartz sand was chosen for a particular purpose. Elsewhere outside of this document, I have read people's theories on this sand, that it is of such a consistency that it would not attract moisture or become solid and wet over the years. Whether or not this has anything to do with the large amount of salt incrustation on the surface of the passageway walls, I couldn't tell you. Hamilton, however, goes for a slightly different approach, instead addressing the possibility that sand could have been used as a mechanism for placing large heavy stones, and cavities such as the ones discovered alongside the western wall of the horizontal passageway could be left over from construction and simply built over when no longer needed. Hamilton doesn't explain what he means by placing stones, whether the sand would be used as some sort of counterweight or something like that. I'm not sure. If anyone has any further clarity on this kind of construction involving sand, then please do reach out and let me know. Zahi Hawass has addressed the existence of these cavities and the expeditions to drill into them in the book he created with Mark Lehner. Zahi writes,
"The Great Pyramid is full of cavities. In this instance, the geophysical surveys probably detected empty spaces and sand fill between the fine Tura quality limestone casing the horizontal passage and the rough masonry filling the pyramid core. The French team then approached the Supreme Council of Antiquities with a new proposal to drill in the middle of the Queen's Chamber, where they thought lay a hidden chamber, but one of us, together with Rainer Stadelmann, recommended that the pyramid should not be drilled simply to test theories."
In light of this statement, it seemed unlikely that further drilling will ever be done, but Hamilton suggests that it would be worth reopening the capped pipes to re-examine the sand within, and I have to agree with him. How likely it is that this will ever happen, however, is another story. All things considered, however, the info on Domion's drilling is very limited. We do not know the thickness of the walls that they drilled into, how big the passages filled with sand actually are, and so on and so forth. I would certainly think that this warrants a further in-depth read of Domion's La Chambre de Cheops, but I am not entirely sure offhand if an English translation exists, and as we've established, my French is atrocious. I will have to do some more digging into this. Entering the Queen's Chamber itself, then, let's take a quick look at the makeup of the walls, which are very smooth mostly, except for some holes where the so-called air shafts meet the chamber itself. These were smashed open on the orders of Wayman Dixon in 1872, but we'll get to these in a moment. Another noticeable feature of the Queen's Chamber is the saddle vault ceiling, the alcove as well, or niche, and the cracked stone that hangs over the entrance to the Queen's Chamber. It's worth noting that there are two large lintel stones over the entrance to the King's Chamber, but the stones in the wall above the entrance to the Queen's Chamber are the same size as the ones used in the rest of the wall's construction. The only thing that attracts your attention to the stones above the entranceway is, as I said, because one of them is cracked. Addressing the name, the Queen's Chamber, Hamilton is quick to remind us that this name has been retained over time, when in fact it's not really an accurate title for the chamber at all. There are those who believe that the Queen's Chamber was the original burial place for Pharaoh Khufu until the pyramid was perhaps expanded and the higher King's Chamber was built. But I'm on the fence with this, as convincing as that argument may be. Modern Egyptologists believe that the Queen's Chamber, despite its name, is not intended for a queen of any kind, but is to act as a so-called blind chamber, or a serdab. This is a chamber that houses a statue of the deceased, whose pyramid it is, and we'll talk more about the possibility of where a Khufu statue may have been erected in a moment. Hamilton references Zahiwas and Mark Lena in this regard, where they claim that serdabs in other ancient Egyptian tombs have a similar rough and unfinished feel, much like that of the Great Pyramid's so-called Queen's Chamber. As we have established, modern Egyptologists believe the Queen's Chamber to now be a serdab, or blind chamber. Famed Muslim cartographer Muhammad al-Idrisi give a conflicting account. Flinders Petrie pointed Idrisi's accounts out in his own writings, stating, "It may be an open question whether the Queen's Chamber was not the sepulchre of Khumnu Khufu, the co-regent of Khufu. Idrisi, in his accurate and observant account of the pyramid, 1236 AD, mentions an empty vessel in the Queen's Chamber, and that this was not a confused notion of the coffer now known, is proven by his saying that in the King's Chamber an empty vessel is seen here similar to the former. Whether any fragments of a coffer remained there amongst the great quantity of stone excavated from the floor and niche, it is almost hopeless to inquire, since the rubbish is now all shot away into various holes and spaces. Caviglia, however, did not find a coffer when cleaning the chamber, but fragments might have been easily overlooked." Now, this is something really interesting to think about. As far as I know, Idrisi's account is the only account to ever reference a coffin or coffer in the Queen's Chamber, but it is not an account that can be dismissed lightly, as Hamilton himself states the same. Hamilton points to the Menkaure pyramid, whose Queen's Chamber equivalent, for lack of a better way of describing it, also has a sarcophagus inside. The problem we have is that al-Idrisi's account is so old and cannot be corroborated. The next account of worth is from Jean Greaves between 1637 and 1640, and he does not write about any sarcophagus or coffer in the Queen's Chamber. In fact, what he writes about is even more perplexing. Talking about leaving the horizontal passage and entering the Queen's Chamber, John Greaves writes,
"This leadeth into an arched vault or little chamber, which, by reason it was full of grave-like smell and half full of rubbish, occasioned my lesser stay. This chamber stands east and west. The length of it is less than 20 feet, the breadth about 17, and the height less than 15. The walls are entire and plastered over with lime. The roof is covered with large smooth stones, not laying flat, but shelving, and meeting above in a kind of arch, or rather an angle. On the east side of this room, in the middle of it, there seems to have been a passage leading to some other place."
As Hamilton states immediately after this quote from Greaves, it is difficult to ascertain what the mess in the Queen's Chamber was, and more importantly, who made it. It is fairly common knowledge that Caviglia, during his return trip to Giza with Howard Weiss, operated on a dig in the Queen's Chamber, but Greaves' account clearly shows that there had been much earlier operations undertaken in the Queen's Chamber. Coming forward in time, however, after the time of Caviglia and Weiss, came the visit of Piazzi Smith, who also had some very interesting things to say about the Queen's Chamber. He talks about how on the way out of the pyramid they stopped to look in at the Queen's Chamber and saw a, quote, monstrous quarry hole in the eastern side of the floor and the strange niche in the wall, and a huge heap of stones and rubbish in the northwest corner, rising nearly a third of the height of the room. I'm not sure if what Piazzi Smith was seeing was the remains of the Caviglia and Weiss excavations, but it's pretty disappointing to think that it could well have been, just because of the absolute state that the Queen's Chamber was left in. As if to say, well, there's nothing of interest here, we are done digging and we found nothing, so Yeah, down tools guys, let's go home. Hamilton includes some diagrams in his guides that show, among other things, where this massive excavation by Weiss was undertaken. These diagrams by pairing also show the excavation that was made behind the corbelled niche. This is often referred to as the forced passage, as pairing here states.
From the recesses at the east end of the chamber is a forced passage extending 50 feet eastward into the pyramid. Excavations C and D in the horizontal passage have been made some years before and filled in again, it is supposed by Mr. Caviglia, and were subsequently reopened and carried to a much greater extent, particularly under the stone that forms the step by Colonel Howard Weiss, who made the excavation E near the recess in the apartment.
Now, this niche is very, very interesting indeed, and it's easy to see why explorers, robbers, what have you, would be tempted to continue digging behind it. This excavation itself starts further back to the east, so let's come back into the Queen's chamber and take a look at the niche itself. It is a corbelled construction built of the stones used to make up the walls of the Queen's chamber. It is off-center to the middle of the room. We can see from the diagram here that it appears to have been deliberately placed just snugly within the southern part of the Great Pyramid's east-west axis, which amazingly runs right through the middle of the Queen's chamber. The niche is 3 cubits wide at its widest point and only 1 cubit wide at its slimmest. Some of the corbels also vary in height for what it's worth. Inside the niche is a small tunnel of several meters in length, and then beyond that is the dig that is referred to as the forced passage. On this area, Mariolio and Rinaldi had the following to say.
Upon close examination of this tunnel, we found that for about 6 or 7 meters starting from the niche end wall, the masonry is composed of large, well-squared and dressed limestone blocks. Beyond these, there is the usual inner nucleus masonry made up of great blocks which are roughly dressed only on the horizontal faces. They have large vertical joints showing no presence of mortar. The courses of this masonry seem to be regular enough and are about 1 meter high, therefore it seems that all around the chamber was built a special kind of masonry which was particularly laid and different from the rest. However, one cannot clearly distinguish between the two qualities of masonry as they are closely bonded and show no definite dividing face.
Addressing the forced passage that extends beyond this tunnel, the pair continue.
It is quite possible that the violators made the tunnel visible today in the end wall of the niche because they found a block which was 1.08 meters wide, 0.84 meters high and 0.95 above the actual pavement and symmetrical with the niche sides there. This symmetry must have raised suspicions in the violators' mind, and they removed the block by breaking the niche above and to the right of the block itself. As both these parts are damaged for the distance of 1.58 meters, it may be that the block was 3 cubits long. After having removed the first block and seeing that the sides of the breach were well dressed with the thin joints, the thieves were even more convinced to have discovered a plugged corridor and continued the breach for almost 15 meters before giving up the undertaking.
Mariolio and Rinaldi produced a similar diagram of this tunnel and the forced excavation beyond it. At first glance, it's easy to perhaps think, where on earth were the tunnelers going? But if you think about the first few meters of the tunnel, which seems purposefully built out of the masonry and was originally capped with a 2 cubits wide stone at the end, which is the width of all the other corridors in the pyramid, you can perhaps understand what the excavators were thinking when they decided to continue in this area. Why was there such a short corridor here? Did it go off somewhere? What was the purpose of this whole niche thing anyway? One can see that the thought process behind digging further down the corridor, but also directly beneath the niche too. Dormion also pointed out the makeup of the ceiling in the purpose-built part of the niche's tunnel. The ceiling stones here are particularly massive, with one of them being as big as 3.37 meters long. A deeper analysis of this area and its construction can be found on the Ancient Architects channel. The link to the video can be found in the description below. If you wish to go and investigate this avenue further, I won't stand in your way. So what of the purpose of this niche then? Gilles Domion has questioned the mainline narrative of the cutaway containing a statue. Instead, he proposed that the niche was some sort of relieving chamber or structure for a hidden passage or chamber that ran beneath the Queen's chamber. The enormous ceiling stones of the niche's tunnel would also seem to play a part in lending credence to this theory. Hamilton, however, does not subscribe much to this, seeming to prefer the statue theory. He proposes that there may have been a symbolic reason for the placing of the niche immediately south of the pyramid's east-west axis. Regarding the tunnel inside the niche, Hamilton suggests that the access to the Queen's chamber via the irregular horizontal passage was perhaps not possible at certain points during construction, and that an alternative route in was required at the time. But as construction went on, the passage behind the niche became superfluous and was closed off, giving the appearance of a dead-end tunnel that would have tempted diggers and thieves. Hamilton's proposal is a sensible theory, this cannot be argued, but I'm not sure if I'm fully on board with it. The entire mysterious nature of the niche and its corridor, including all of the details we have just covered in the last few minutes, scream out to me that there is more going on here than meets the eye. But I haven't come to any personal conclusions as of yet. I'd love to know what you think of the Queen's Chamber's niche and of its purpose. If you have any thoughts on this, then please reach out and comment below. I would love to hear from you. Now, we've spent a fair bit of time talking about the niche. Let's take a closer look at the Queen's Chamber itself. From the picture on screen, we can see that the chamber was once much blacker than it currently is in modern times. This is attributed to soot from the torches of earlier explorers and was cleaned away in much more recent history. Regarding the rough, seemingly unfinished floor of the Queen's chamber, Mariolio and Rinaldi would state that the floor is actually exposed core masonry. They conclude that a pavement of limestone slabs were once laid on the Queen's chamber floor, and as Hamilton himself says, just because there isn't a surviving fine floor there today, that doesn't mean that flooring was never fitted. There are cuts in the flooring that may indicate that additional flooring on top was once present. There are arguments too, however, between scholars on if such a floor existed, then how thick was the floor. Mariolio and Rinaldi suggested a 1 cubit thickness to the floor, but Petrie didn't seem to agree, believing it to be even thinner. Mariolio and Rinaldi suggested 1 cubit, double that of Petrie's proposed floor. I believe they suggested this because the flooring in other passages within the Great Pyramid have much thicker flooring blocks, but as Hamilton points out, most of the other passageways are inclined or designed to withstand much greater weights, such as the granite plugstones designed to slide down the Grand Gallery and into the ascending passageway joint. No such design is known to exist for the Queen's Chamber, and much less traffic could be expected to take place in the horizontal passage. Therefore, a thinner flooring block size could well have been used, such as the proposed size by Petrie. The diagram from Hamilton on screen is very handy in showing what the two parties proposed and how it actually looks if deployed in the Queen's Chamber. Looking at the ceiling then, this is very interesting. We have touched on the ceiling of the Queen's Chamber in the North Face corridor video recently because that appears to be similar, but it is in fact different. You can check out a video on the subject from History for Granite for a much more in-depth look into this. I will of course link this in the video description too. Here, however, in the Queen's Chamber, we have a, dare I say, traditional saddle vault ceiling consisting of 6 pairs of stones that do not align with their opposites but overlap. Again, from Hamilton's diagram on the different flooring levels, we can see that the ceiling blocks greatly overextend past the visible boundaries of the Queen's Chamber. We can confirm this because there is, or was perhaps, an excavation in the northwest corridor of the Queen's Chamber. It cannot be said for certain how far these stones extend, but at least we know that they do extend past the visible boundary. Hamilton also points to earlier pyramids of the 5th and 6th Egyptian dynasties, where further layers of beams were placed above the visible beams of the immediate ceiling, but it is unknown if this is the case of the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. All in all, the roof design seems incredibly solid, and I'm no structural engineer, as I'm sure you can tell, but the Queen's Chamber construction gives off a far more sturdy appearance to me than that of the King's Chamber, what with its flat, enormous granite slabs which are showing cracks, but we'll get to the King's Chamber later in this video. For now, let's take a look at the final element of the Queen's Chamber, and arguably the most fascinating element, an element which most likely should have had a video all of its own, but hey, we're already here now, so when in Rome, or when in Giza, yes, of course, it is time to talk about the 2 shafts that lead away from the Queen's Chamber, one to the north and one to the south. As we know, there is a very similar pair of shafts in the King's Chamber, but there are quite a few differences between the 2 pairs, and we're about to go deep on these shafts, so maybe if you're still here with me, pause the video for a minute, stretch your legs, get a drink, because this is going to get a bit in depth. Now, something that I will absolutely explore in further videos is the purpose of these shafts. They have been called air shafts, they have been called star shafts. So with the air shaft theory, they provide ventilation to the workers inside the pyramid. And then on the other hand, entire books and theses have been written on the theory that the shafts are aligned to certain stars, having some sort of theological or astronomical purpose. I am currently reading The Orion Mystery by Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert, which is probably one of the more popular pieces of work on the star shaft theory, so we will explore that in much more detail in a follow-up video. But for now, let's just stick with the fact that, well, nobody really truly knows what these shafts were used for. The first main difference then between the shafts in the King's Chamber, which we will of course explore in due time, and the ones here in the Queen's Chamber, are that the ones in the King's Chamber were left open. Here in the Queen's Chamber, they are covered over, or were covered over. Their discovery, as we said earlier, is attributed to one Layman Dixon, who, using clues on the location of the shafts in the King's Chamber, ascertained the locations of the openings to the Queen's Chamber shafts, and had the stone smashed open to reveal them. Hamilton writes that it is important to note that the shafts were hidden behind stocks of stone left in the masonry, and were not hidden behind added patches of stone. Something I've discussed with people online is the construction of the air shafts. How on earth was something so narrow carved out of the pyramid masonry? When you take them at face value, the existence of these shafts is a bit mind-boggling, but Hamilton clears this up superbly with this excellent diagram about how these shafts were carved out of blocks of masonry and then set into their place. It's genius, really, in its simplicity. Like much of the pyramid, this and the others, the construction and the methods used for so long ago is just astounding. Anyway, before we move on, we have to address the Queen's Chamber shafts were sealed. Again, not by a blockage or patch of stone, but by a stock of stone left in the actual stone walls. It seems, at least by its completion, the Queen's Chamber did not require these shafts, and they were sealed up even in their original construction. But why? Well, nobody knows, which is extremely frustrating. What's even stranger is when Wayman Dixon did break into the shafts from the Queen's Chamber, he found a few artifacts, all of which are now quite famous for obvious reasons. In which shaft or where in the shaft these artifacts were found is also frustratingly mostly wishy-washy information. We'll come back to this though in just a moment. Just to clarify what was found, the artifacts found were a stone ball made of dolerite, a metal hook made of copper, and a strip of wood made of cedar. On these discoveries, the eminent Zahiawas has to say,
"We are still uncertain as to what specifically Dixon found inside these air shafts. We do know, however, that he unearthed a copper implement often described as a hook. It was located at the bottom of the southern shaft's entrance among debris. Dixon also pulled out a wooden shaft and a granite ball often described as a sculptor's tool from the bottom of the north shaft, where he found it hidden amongst a small amount of debris."
Now, this is something very interesting to think about. Why? Well, often the cedar wood and copper hook are spoken about as if they are both from the same tool and have broken apart. However, according to Hawas's account, they were found in completely different shafts, so this cannot be true. If Hawas's account is correct, that is, this history of these so-called Dixon relics is quite an interesting one. Believe it or not, they were thought lost until very recently, actually, as recent as 2019, when they were rediscovered in a university in Aberdeen, of all places. The most sought-after piece of this collection of artifacts was the wooden handle, as wood can be carbon dated. This was finally carried out after the items were rediscovered, and the carbon dating puts the age of the cedar wood strip at about 500 years before the current accepted dating for the building of the Great Pyramid. Hamilton advises us that this is not unusual and that other carbon dating performed in Egypt has produced similar results. There is a bit of swing in the accuracy of carbon dating, which can account somewhat for this 500-year discrepancy. I've also read elsewhere that Egyptians often reuse their wood as much as possible due to the scarcity of the material in the deserts west of the Nile, at least so back in the day. So it is possible then that the cedar wood was part of a tool that was used many times before it was used on or lost in the Great Pyramid. Either way though, and Hamilton points this out clearly, and I quote, "The wood being found in a sealed shaft is clearly contemporary to the construction of the pyramid." As in, if the shaft is sealed and the old tool was lost inside during construction and has been there this whole time until it was discovered, well, that means that the Great Pyramid cannot be older than 4,500 years, right? Otherwise, the carbon-dated wood that was sealed inside one of its smaller tunnels would also age back far further than 4,500 years. Just something to think about there, as there are plenty of people who subscribe to the theories that the pyramid is much older or placed here by a lost ancient race. The type of theories that are proliferated by Graham Hancock and the like, and I don't mean this as a slight to Graham Hancock or those who make similar theories and propositions, and nor to the people that believe him or even just enjoy his or others' work of that nature, but it is hard to argue with that 4,500 year carbon dated wood. Anyway, these Dixon relics were not the only thing to become lost in the shafts of the Great Pyramid. As I'm sure you can imagine, early explorers had a lot more difficulty investigating these shafts than we do today. Some extended metal rods were used to poke around and investigate the length of these shafts, and some of these are still stuck in the Queen's Chamber northern shaft today. The southern shaft runs a much smoother route, whereas the northern one bends somewhat to circumvent the Grand Gallery, so its route is a bit more tortuous, and the rods no doubt got stuck in the bends and therefore trapped inside the shafts. Enter the Upwat project, spearheaded by one Rudolf Gantenbrink, who absolutely changed the game when it came to exploring the air shafts of the Great Pyramid. In 1992 and 1993, his team would explore the shafts using a small robot. This was very successful, again in the southern shaft, but the robot encountered issues climbing the northern shaft. The robot did get to the end of the southern shaft, however, releasing some of the most famous modern imagery from exploration of the Great Pyramid, a limestone block that some call a door with what appears to be oxidized copper hoops sticking out of it. Incredible. In 2002, another robot, this time from the National Geographic, would drill through this block, but we'll get to that in a moment. Back to Gantenbrink. Having explored all of the shafts in the Great Pyramid, he noticed that the final blocks used in the construction of the ends of the shafts differed from those blocks used throughout the rest of the shafts. The shafts are made from the regular core masonry blocks from what Gantenbrink calls local limestone. However, addressing the final set of blocks in each shaft, Gantenbrink stated,
"But the final block before the slab is definitely carved from lighter coloured limestone, probably originating from the Mogotio Mountains about 30 kilometres from the Giza Plateau on the other side of the Nile. This was the material that the builders used for the higher quality casing stones of the pyramid's exterior and for the chamber systems. The workmanship of the last block in front of the slab is also much higher than anything we have seen in any of the shafts so far."
Now, Gantenbrink also collated all of his info into a super useful CAD diagrams, which have been invaluable to those investigating the internal makeup of the Great Pyramid. But a very conscientious YouTuber has uploaded all of them to YouTube for the general public to see. I have of course added a link to that video in the description. Here we can see a CAD diagram of the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. Remember how we said the shafts were constructed being cut out of blocks and placed onto floor blocks to create a tunnel or shaft? And look again at this wonderful CAD diagram. We can see that the lower blocks are placed vertically with the tunnel carving lined up perfectly through them. This is because the additional strength and reinforcement was needed to offset the pressure from the roof beams of the Queen's Chamber. But beyond this point, we can see that the Queen's Chamber southern shaft extends upwards in a fairly uniform fashion, until you get to the 8th block, which appears unfinished. Gantenbrink supposes the cause for this being that the block was placed down before being dressed. He explains how Egyptian builders first shaped the shaft from the blocks using a chipping chisel and then finished them or dressed them with a pointed chisel. This appears to have been missed for block 8 of the Queen's Chamber southern shaft, as well as block 9 to follow it, and 3 others in the upper portions of the shafts. A considerable ways further up the shaft, there is a displacement of stone, as pictured here on screen. Gantenbrink would state in regards to this,
"Blocks number 16 and 17 are offset by about 3 to 4 centimeters. It is impossible to determine with any certainty whether this deviation occurred during the original construction or at a later date. The spot lies just under the floor level of the King's Chamber, where Petrie discovered unusual settling. It is possible that this settling and the observed deviations were caused by an earthquake during the pyramid's construction."
Further up the shaft between blocks 19 and 26, Gantenbrink's robot discovered unusual scratches in the walls. These scratches appear towards the bottom of the walls. You can just about make them out in the pictures shown on screen. Was this caused by the probing done by earlier explorers and their rods? Perhaps, perhaps not. Gantenbrink suggests that something may have been dragged up the southern shaft before its final completion, but he does not expand on this. In a similar area of the southern shaft on block 21, Gantenbrink points out
a bit of light-coloured mortar, most likely gypsum, adhering to the wall of the shaft, gives the impression that here something was originally attached to the wall. We made an identical find farther along the shaft at block number 26.
As for what these deposits of mortar could have held, Gantenbrink suggests that string was held there, potentially as a way of measuring the shafts. At the beginning of block 26 is a not insignificant amount of damage to the floor of the shaft. This piqued my interest, especially after what Gantenbrink had to say on the matter. He explains firstly that the pressure on the shaft at this point would be significantly less than it would be further down the shaft. For example, near the Queen's Chamber, 115 meters of pyramid bears down onto the shaft at that point. At the point where there is a breakage, only 35 meters of pyramid above remains. That is still a considerable amount of stone, don't get me wrong, but I understand what Gantenbrink is trying to say here. Because of this, he doesn't attribute the break to downward pressure. Instead, he proposes two other theories. The first is that the construction work below block 26 and the previous block 25 may be particularly shoddy, extremely inept, as Gantenbrink himself puts it. He is quick to contradict this argument, however, reminding us that we are nearing the end of the shaft tunnel, which displays better quality masonry work, as we have touched on a little earlier on. The second theory is that there is the possibility of the existence of an undiscovered structure below or perhaps above this particular section of shaft. Gantenbrink advises that such a structure could create a pressure peak, placing a considerable amount of force onto the shaft and causing the damage that we see. But is there further potential evidence for an undiscovered structure in this area? On blocks 27 and 28, what appear to be cutting grooves can be found in the stone. Gantenbrink suggests the blocks affected served as a base for the cutting of precision joints, and that's why we see these marks on the stone here. But what precision joints were cut here with the blocks in place? Gantenbrink breaks this down for us. We mentioned earlier that the shaft blocks were dressed with a chisel. We know this is the case from inspecting the surfaces of the blocks, but also because of Caviglia's tunnels that he crudely dug around the bottom of the King's Chamber northern air shaft, and at the top of the same shaft in the form of the so-called man-killer tunnel. Gantenbrink was able to inspect the abutting edges from these digs, and along with other astute inspection techniques, Gantenbrink was able to confidently say that 9 out of 10 surfaces of a shaft block were definitely chiseled. He used this to develop the assumption that no sawing was used in construction of the shaft blocks. On top of this, Gantenbrink goes on to say,
the pyramid's nearest casing stones, which lie 19 meters distant from this spot in the shaft, were cut in the final position. We know this because the stones located directly beneath the accordion stones display cutting grooves. The pyramid's corridor and chamber system, which also displays precise cut joints, had been completed long before this shaft construction level was reached. Taken together, these findings constitute a compelling case for a possible, as yet undiscovered structure, for which precise joints were made in the upper region of the southern Queen's Chamber shaft.
Reading about this, it was the first time I had come across such a suggestion for some sort of structure to exist in this part of the pyramid. Keith Hamilton is quick to remind us, however, that the Scan Pyramids project has thus far not discovered anything of note in this particular area. But that doesn't mean we should write off this avenue entirely just yet. The pyramid is full of surprises, that much is for sure. And now we come to the end of the Queen's Chamber southern shaft, and we are faced with the stone with the copper pins once more. Gantenbrink suggested that the stone stone is not mortared in place but is actually slightly bigger than the passage, and only the bottom edge of it is of course visible. Well, at least for Gantenbrink's team. There was the Nat Geo project in 2002 that further explored the tunnels using a robot, and they drilled a hole through this so-called door. And once again in 2010 there was the Jedi project, whose robot re-explored the Queen's Chamber shafts and placed a flexible camera through the hole that the Nat Geo team had made, allowing for far better images to be captured. This was quite a big event at the time, and I'm sure whilst plenty of people were disappointed with every peek behind the shaft doors, there are some elements here that are well worth noting down. Why might people be disappointed with what was found then? Well, there was nothing really behind the door, just a small cavity that appeared to not lead anywhere. For me, this raises as many questions as its presence as a dead end may possibly answer, and with Gantenbrink's talk of a secret structure somewhere beneath this area, my mind races with thoughts that I still haven't quite formed into cohesive arguments just yet. Using the flexible Jedi project camera in 2010, we can see that the copper pins seem to loop through the door or blocking stone, as we can see from this shot here. Even more fascinatingly, in this footage we can see marks, some sort of hieroglyphs, painted onto these surfaces. Another thing I hadn't come across before until I read Keith's guide was that a researcher named Luca Mattiello suggested this hieroglyph marking meant 121 or 121 because the shaft itself was 121 cubits long. Now that wasn't strictly true, and there's a lot of back and forth on this, but I don't subscribe much to this. However, there are links with this number to the geometric studies performed by John Legon, but I have yet to read his work, so we'll reserve judgment for now. Hamilton himself, however, looks to Legon when considering the purpose of the shafts. He directly quotes him on the following:
"It should be more obvious than ever, therefore, that the design of these shafts were determined by considerations of geometry, symmetry, and a desire for coherent dimensional design, and can have nothing to do with the conjectured astronomical alignments."
That statement is like purposefully aimed bird droppings sent from a great height onto the star shaft theories popularized by Robert Bouval and the like. In a less savage way than Legon, Hamilton goes on to explain how the air shaft theory is also unsuitable, saying that although, as we discussed earlier, there is a difference of opinion on how perhaps the shafts were sealed, the shafts in the Queen's Chamber have always been sealed and have never penetrated the surface of the pyramid at their topmost point, at the exit point rather, or at the chamber end. In this section, Hamilton references Roma, Hawass, Petrie, and the Edgar brothers' varying accounts, concluding as he did earlier in the document that at the chamber end the shafts were not sealed after the fact, but there was several inches of stone left in place during the cut, and in fact the Queen's Chamber shafts had never been opened ever at the Queen's Chamber end until Wayman Dixon smashed them in. Speaking of Dixon, Hamilton takes this moment in the document to explain the exact circumstance of Dixon discovering the shafts is also not entirely clear. Some accounts say that the holes to the Queen's Chamber shafts were smashed in using a hammer and a steel chisel. Others say that a hole was drilled. There is a fantastic picture in the guide that shows a large crack running down the south wall of the Queen's Chamber, which may easily have given away the location of the potential entrance to the shaft. This fracture in the wall does appear to have been wide enough in order to let in the soot and smog that cover the rest of the Queen's Chamber in earlier days, as an article in the Nature publication from 1872 states that this was found inside the shaft entrance after it was broken open by Dixon and his men. On the contrary, the description of the opening of the northern shaft is quite different, indicating that it was found clean and with its mortar perfectly white. On the subject of the northern shaft then, and we can see that its path is a lot more convoluted than the southern shaft. Why then are the shafts here, as well as in the King's Chamber, not placed in different locations? What is the significance of their exact positions that additional awkward work was undertaken to route them around structures like the Grand Gallery? In the Queen's Chamber, the impression is given that the shafts are directly opposite each other. However, in reality, they are offset somewhat, as shown in the diagram on screen. Likewise, the King's Chamber shafts above are slightly further east than the ones in the Queen's Chamber, but as I said, face similar challenges in their placement as the Queen's Chamber shafts. Was there slight off placement in regards to both the differences between King's and Queen's chambers and that of the alignment on opposing walls a design choice or a builder error? Whilst this cannot be discounted, Hamilton is of the opinion that this is not the case, and I happen to agree. Looking at the CAD data for the northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, however, and this is all we have, which is not much in comparison to the southern one, this is, as we've covered, because of the issue that Gantenbrink's robot had in navigating this first bend that the northern shaft takes around the Grand Gallery. Gantenbrink does seem to think that the original builders accounted for the Grand Gallery, or at least for the shaft running right into its path. He uses the extreme angle at which the shaft dodges the gallery on block 4 to reiterate this point. Around block 7, there is a portion of an iron rod in the northern shaft. It is interesting that there isn't any reports of rods being used in this particular shaft, so Gantenbrink concludes that this was used in some sort of unofficial exploration. On blocks 8 and 9 of the northern shaft, Gantenbrink's robots recorded what appear to be chisel marks left unfinished on the walls. Despite the angle change back at block 4, it's actually after block 9 that the shaft starts to change direction to fully avoid colliding with the Grand Gallery. You can see here that Gantenbrink's robot was not the only thing that had difficulty getting around this corner. On the left here we can see a rod that Gantenbrink attributed to belonging to the explorer Layman Dixon, and on the left a square, or should I say a rectangular shaped rod whose owner appears to be a mystery to Gantenbrink. The 1993 robot failed to get around the corner successfully, just like these rods, and this image is the last that we see from this expedition. Hamilton, however, disputes Gantenbrink's claim that the rod on the left belonged to Layman Dixon. He instead points to a lengthy account from one of the Edgar brothers, Morton Edgar, on how they commissioned rods to be made for the purpose of exploring the shafts of the Great Pyramid. Morton Edgar writes of having wooden balls attached to the end of his shafts in order to stop the metal getting stuck on any corners or in any crevices or cracks, etc., etc. When the National Geographic robot went up the Queen's Chamber northern shaft in 2002, it was able to pass over the rods and navigate the awkward turn at block 9, and it eventually made its way all the way to the end of the shaft, finding another so-called door, much like the southern airshaft door we studied a few minutes ago. But the report from the 2002 Nat Geo mission also cleared up a few of the misconceptions around the rods. The report reads that the two metal rods remain in place, though they were moved slightly as a result of the first phase of investigation. At 84 feet, we saw the knob on the end of the smaller iron rod. At 119 feet was the end of the second rod that also has a knob fitted to its end. Now, with both rods featuring wooden balls attached to their ends, this would seem to confirm that Hamilton's theory is correct, and that Gantenbrink was incorrect. From their design, it seems that both of these rods belonged to the Edgar brothers. Now, as I said earlier, I will be doing some videos following up on the star shaft theory. The first will explore the theory and what it promises, and the second video will be similar to this, directly exploring the documentation itself. In this case, The Orion Mystery by Robert Bouval and Adrian Gilbert. Of course, these people are not the only ones to have spoken about the star shaft theory, but this must be one of the most popular writings on the subject. However, I bring this up again because in this part of the Layman's Guide, Hamilton shares his own thoughts on the star shaft theories, and admittedly it contains points that I immediately thought of too. We know from the recent few minutes of this video that the shafts, especially in the case of the northern shafts, do not take a direct path to the surface of the pyramid. The winding, bendy nature of the shaft's path surely means it cannot point to a particular star or constellation of stars. If you subscribe to the idea that the two openings in the shaft are part of some ritualistic travel to the afterlife, then these bendy shafts seem to do a really bad job of that. For now, let's draw a line under the shafts, which we have spent a fair bit of time on. If this is not enough for you, I've linked in the description below 2 videos by ancient architects in which the Queen's Chamber northern shaft is dissected in immense detail as well, and it's well worth a watch. But as far as the Layman's Guide goes, it's time to move on up to the next level, to the topmost southern end of the Grand Gallery, where we will find the Antechamber. The Antechamber is a small chamber that is the main security point and only way in insofar that we know of and actually have seen, to the King's Chamber. It appears to have at one point contained a series of granite portcullis blocks that would have sealed the King's Chamber completely from the outside world. These portcullis blocks are long gone, but let's take a look at the design and makeup of this area. Hamilton first describes the chamber's construction. Its north wall shares the back end of the stones that make up the south end of the Grand Gallery. The majority of the chamber then transitions from this regular masonry stone to granite stones, I'd imagine due to the hardness of this material and how difficult it would be to circumnavigate or destroy. The flooring appears to be slightly uneven, and therefore Hamilton reports that the height of the antechamber does vary throughout the small space. In the photo currently on screen, you can clearly see the change from limestone masonry to granite stone being used. To the right here, you can also see the excavation that Caviglia made towards the bottom end of the King's Chamber northern shaft. This excavation then follows the shaft for a small ways before terminating. Nowadays, as we've covered in other videos, this excavation is blocked off and contains air conditioning equipment which regulates the environment within the Great Pyramid. We can see from Perring's drawing of Caviglia's excavation that the King's Chamber northern shaft deviates direction much like the Queen's Chamber northern shaft, but it does so much sooner in its journey. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, so let's get back to the antechamber. We can see here one of the Edgar brothers standing between the north wall of the antechamber and the granite leaf within the antechamber, which begins the small area where the 3 portcullis stones were housed. The pilasters which guided the portcullis stones have been knocked away with time, but Hamilton points out using this Edgar brothers photo that they are still somewhat visible. Regarding the granite leaf, which we can see one of the Edgars ducking under in this picture, is that one side of it was chiseled down completely, leaving a semicircular boss of stone unchiseled. one immediately starts to think why the effort was undertaken to perform this task. Chiseling a solid inch of stone off one side of this thing must have been a hefty piece of work, and it's hard to ascertain why they did it, at least immediately. The granite leaf in general is a bit of a mystery. Hamilton writes and he explains that some of the earlier explorers initially thought it to be a fourth portcullis stone that had failed to be lowered. Further exploration quickly put this theory to rest, however, as the wall grooves in which it rests only extend down to about roof level of the horizontal passage that runs underneath it. It simply cannot descend any further than its current point. The leaf is made of two granite slabs on top of each other, and we can see the joint clearly in this photo of the boss, which was left on the north side. Petrie would comment on the workmanship of the granite leaf and of the antechamber in general being far lower than elsewhere in the pyramid, but Hamilton is quick to remind us that the antechamber would have been an entirely utilitarian space to house a security feature of 3 lowered portcullis blocks and wouldn't necessarily require fine craftsmanship. Whilst the pilasters that surrounded the portcullis stones have been mostly destroyed, in this photo we can clearly see the pilasters that are still in place on the granite leaf, which gives us a good idea of what the rest of them originally looked like. Looking up, we can see the wainscots, in which Hamilton describes in great detail, careful to point out that they are actually at different levels, questioning whether this was accidental or by design. The topmost surface of the upper leaf stone is also irregular and appears to be damaged, but Flinders Petrie would suggest that this rough surface was actually just the natural appearance of a granite boulder from which the leaf stone was carved. What caught my attention in this area, however, was this photo by the Edgar brothers. Hamilton draws our attention to this small black space to the western end of the granite leaf. What is this? Is this simply the excess topmost cut of a mortise and a tenon joint that is holding the leaf blocks in place, or is it something else? Hamilton points out that the rigging holding the portcullis stones up could have been fed through and held in place between the two granite stones in the leaf. A length of wood could have been placed and wedged tightly up against the bottom side of the stone boss, and if this wood was struck with suitable force, the dark spot on the western wall indicates perhaps that there is space within the mortise for the topmost granite stone in the leaf to travel upwards after the application of such force, letting loose the rigging held between the two stones and sending the portcullis stones crashing to the ground. The top stone of the granite leaf would then fall back naturally into place with the wood taken away or fallen away, and this is the position that we see it in today. Possibly. That's what I take away from this section, at least. Again, it is likely that the portcullis stones in their original position were held up by some sort of supports. Leaving the rigging under such intense strain would probably have not been possible, especially considering that nobody could have really predicted when Khufu would pass away. Again, potentially, pieces of wood could have fulfilled this role, as shown in this diagram by Mariolio and Rinaldi. In said diagram, we can see the rough top edge of the granite leaf that Petrie thought was the natural surface of the boulder from which the leaf stone was carved, but the leaf terminating where it does leaves a security flaw. Hamilton points out that even with the portcullis stones descended, all a thief would need to do is climb over the granite leaf, over the top of the dropped portcullis system, and start hacking and bashing at the bottom of the southern wall of the king's chamber. Granted, this wall is made of granite, and would take some considerable effort to get through, but it does seem to render the portcullis system a bit redundant. Perhaps Flinders Petrie is wrong. Perhaps the leaf once did extend to the ceiling, perhaps a third leaf stone was attached to the ceiling, and the second stone, now the middle stone, with the boss, was still used to release the portcullises as we just described. I don't know. I am now in speculation territory. What do you think of this? And please let me know if you have any opinions on the security features of the antechamber. It is a bit of a head scratcher. To round out this antechamber section, I want to point out that Hamilton's personal reconstruction diagram here is a fantastic one. It accounts for the mortise and tenon joint that was discussed, as well as a potential covering stone, a proposal which satisfies both Petrie's suggestion that the leaf's topmost surface was supposed to be that way, and also satisfies the security issue in leaving a gap above the granite leaf. I think this is a pretty realistic interpretation of what the antechamber looked like before Khufu's death and potential burial within the king's chamber. Speaking of which, the King's Chamber. 10 cubits wide by 20 cubits long, the all-granite King's Chamber is the star of the show, the heart of the pyramid. An impressive and imposing room, at least from the pictures. I've not been there myself yet. One can empathise with some of the more out-there theorists who claim that the room looks like an industrial construction. This is often put forward by the power plant theory folks. It has an utilitarian appearance, therefore it must be a reactor or a generator of some kind. I mean, that isn't something that I believe personally, but something I will touch on in great detail in the future. I appreciate such theories are not everybody's cup of tea, but there is a loud minority who fall into this camp, and to me it warrants investigation. Anyway, all I'm saying here for the purposes of this video is that the so-called King's Chamber does have a cold industrial appearance. It is unlike any other room or chamber I have ever seen, and it is a place that haunts me, for lack of a better word. When I close my eyes, I can see it clearly there, that granite rectangle of a room. Anyway, the chamber is constructed of 5 courses of granite stone blocks, all of which are of equal height. The stone flooring appears to be placed after the walls rather than the walls being placed on the flooring, so there are 2 heights really that people quote, one being the height of all 5 courses of wall granite, the other being the height from the floor to the ceiling. Piazzi Smith's work reveals to us, however, that the height from the floor to ceiling varies throughout the chamber, something that Petrie also touched upon. I'm unsure as to what has caused this, whether it be some sort of settling or perhaps seismic activity, but evidence of the latter can be found elsewhere within the chamber, which we will touch on in a moment. Hamilton states that 100 blocks of granite is thought to make up the walls of the King's Chamber. Couple that with the imposing ceiling, constructed of 9 visible enormous granite beams, and yeah, you've got a lot of granite. As always, mathematics comes heavily into play here, which sounds like a very daft statement, but the pyramid is full of these amazing apparent coincidences. Let me quote directly from Hamilton here. Correcting for open joints, Petrie determined the best value for the cubit from the chamber as 20.63 inches. If we accept a cubit of 20.63, then the height of each course amounts to 2 cubits, 2 palms. Doesn't that sound familiar? Or 64 digits, or 47.15 inches. This would mean that the total height of the 5 courses was 5 times 64 equals 320 digits, and as the chamber is 20 cubits long, or 560 digits, it follows that the circuit of the long wall is 1760 digits. This number would agree with the perimeter of the pyramid base being 1760 cubits. Moreover, if we divide the circuit of the long wall with the width of the chamber, which is 280 digits, the pyramid height being 280 cubits, we obtain the same 22/7 ratio exhibited on the exterior of the pyramid. Honestly, this stuff absolutely blows my mind. Like, how can this be a coincidence? It cannot be, right? So let's take a look at some of the features of the so-called King's Chamber. Keith Hamilton rightly draws our attention to the King's Chamber southern shaft. After entering the room and looking at the southern wall, it is most likely going to be the first thing that we notice, not only due to the odd shape of the shaft opening, but due to the large amounts of damage done to the wall around it. I'm not entirely sure who or what caused this damage, but I don't think it is out of the realms of possibility to think that somebody tried digging or blasting their way around or under the King's Chamber shaft. This damage may have been an attempt to widen the shaft. I simply do not know, so I will keep my predictions to a minimum. Looking at the western end of the chamber, and we will see the famed sarcophagus, or to keep everyone else happy, a granite box that may or may not be a sarcophagus. Personally, I am currently of the persuasion that this granite box is indeed the sarcophagus of Pharaoh Khufu. Out of all the evidence available that I have seen thus far, this is what I think it is most likely to be. That's hardly a groundbreaking revelation, I know, but there are a lot of you out there who think otherwise. As I've said, we will investigate these other avenues very soon. For now though, for the purposes of the remainder of this video, I will be referring to it as the King's Chamber sarcophagus. In these fantastic floor plan drawings by Piazzi Smith, we can see the layout of the blocks that make up the King's Chamber. We can also see that there is a block missing in the floor near the sarcophagus, and it is reported here that Howard Weiss enlarged this excavation under this block, although I am not quite sure exactly what he was looking for here. The Weiss/Caviglia days' methods of exploration were particularly destructive, so it doesn't surprise me at all that one of them was involved. Looking to the ceiling, we can see the enormous granite slabs that make up the construction. Perhaps somewhat worryingly, all of these beams have been cracked. Flinders Petrie would write,
"These openings or cracks are but a mild sign of the great injury that the whole chamber has sustained, probably by an earthquake, when every roof beam was broken across near the south side, and since which the whole of the granite ceiling, weighing near 400 tons, is upheld solely by sticking and thrusting. Not only has this wreck overtaken the chamber itself, but in every one of the spaces above it there are massive roof beams either cracked across or torn out of the wall, more or less at the south side, and the great eastern and western walls of limestone, between and independent of which the whole of these construction chambers are built, have sunk bodily. All these motions are yet but smaller, only a matter of an inch or two, but enough to wreck the theoretical strength of these chambers, and to make their downfall a mere question of time and earthquakes."
Looking more closely at these cracked, imposing ceiling beams will reveal dark rectangular patches that appear every so often throughout the chamber's ceiling. Zahi Hawass and Mark Layman wrote about these patches in their book, indicating that they may be caused by wooden support beams that were put in place, perhaps after the cracks in the King's Chamber ceiling were first noticed. Very interestingly, Keith Hamilton advises that other authors have suggested that instead, these potential wooden beams were part of some sort of internal framework that make up a shrine inside the King's Chamber. This theory is countered by the question, if a wooden shrine or chamber was constructed within the King's Chamber, then why were the granite stones used here dressed to such a high quality? It would seem pointless to make them look as good as they do, especially when regular fine limestone is used mostly elsewhere, just to cover them up. Keith, in all of his brilliance, found another issue too. How did they get such tall beams inside the King's Chamber, assuming they were brought in after the construction of the chamber and the roof was in place and cracks were then found afterward? In his modelling software, Keith struggled to get beams of the required size around the turn in the ascending-descending passage junction, before it was plugged up, of course. This is, of course, assuming that this was the only way to get in to the King's Chamber. There's theories which we have discussed in other videos since the discovery of the north face corridor behind the chevrons at the pyramid's main entrance. That could well be another set of tunnels within the pyramid. Some call these secret funerary tunnels, and they could either terminate at the north end of the Grand Gallery or perhaps next to the sarcophagus of the King's Chamber. We're in the realm of fantasy here, though, as there is no solid evidence for these tunnels, despite great minds like Jean-Pierre Houdin also theorizing their potential existence. But these potential funerary tunnels are a recurring theme in my investigations into the pyramid. Going back to Keith's conundrum about getting the long beams around the ascending-descending passageway junction, he suggests that it is possible that the beams were brought in through Al-Mamun's tunnel, which would mean that they were brought in long after the pyramid's construction and subsequent breaching, and that the beams in this case would have been a part of a restoration effort, again no doubt fueled by the worrying cracks in the King's Chamber ceiling. Moving beyond the King's Chamber momentarily then, we can take a quick look at the structure above it. We will come back to this in a minute, but just for now let's just focus on this small part. As mentioned in part 1 of this series, if we go back outside from the King's Chamber via the Antechamber at the top of the Grand Gallery, there is a very small tunnel which seems like a bit of a nightmare to get to. This leads to the so-called Davidson's Chamber, the first of several chambers that exist above the King's Chamber. All of these chambers have westernized names and were given them in the period of their discovery. This tunnel from the Grand Gallery to the first of these chambers, directly above the cracked ceiling of the King's Chamber, is often said to have been excavated by the builders of the Great Pyramid in order for them to ascertain further the level of damage caused to the King's Chamber ceiling by an earthquake or some other disturbance. But Hamilton asks why they would need to do this. If the pyramid was completed or near completion, then there would be nothing that the builders could have done to repair or replace the King's Chamber ceiling without dismantling a fair amount of the whole pyramid, which is just not a realistic option. If the earthquake occurred during construction, then repairing the beams would have been fairly straightforward in comparison. There is no real way of knowing, however, when in time the earthquake struck. There is no way to tell, is there? Even if it was an earthquake at all, we just don't know. One assumes that it must be to cause this sort of damage, but we simply do not know anything for sure. In light of all of this, Keith Hamilton suggests that the tunnel that leads to the so-called Davidson's Chamber above the King's Chamber was more than likely dug by explorers, or in his words, searchers, as they investigated the Great Pyramid. So back to the sarcophagus. This damaged granite box has attracted much attention, mainly for the reasons I stated a few moments ago. Again, this mysterious box appears to conform to the common pyramid measurement of 2 cubits high, but this does not account for any missing lid that may once have been attached, which would send the height of it over 2 cubits. On the western side of the sarcophagus there are 3 holes which appear to have possibly housed pins that kept the sarcophagus lid in place. Much noise is made about a small pebble that appears to have once been lodged under the south end of the sarcophagus, perhaps to help maneuver the heavy box around. Both Petrie and Piazzi Smith have commented on this pebble, but I can draw no solid conclusions on why it was there or what it was used for, if anything. Interestingly, if one was able to use the gap caused by the lodged pebble and lift the coffer off the floor, one would see on the bottom-facing granite surface of the sarcophagus the words "Lifted 9th of April 1882 WMF Petrie" scrawled in chalk upon it. Petrie admitted that this is the only time he ever did anything like this in all of his explorations. So, the remaining element inside the King's Chamber we have not yet covered are of course the shafts. They are much like the shafts in the Queen's Chamber, only these ones were never covered at the chamber end, and they also penetrated the surface of the pyramid. They were once blocked with debris, more than once actually, but it was cleared out by Howard Weiss. These would later become blocked again with sandstone and more debris, and were once again cleared out again, perhaps more thoroughly it seems, by Morton Edgar, who had his team use a boring rod to push the debris from the outside inwards. It was then collected and removed. It does seem that then modifications to the pyramid were made by Edgar in order to stop the shaft from continuing to ingest sand, dirt and stone. It would be interesting to see these modifications that Edgar and his men made. If anyone knows anything more about this piece of work, then please do get in touch. Gantenbrink, whose work we covered earlier in exploring the Queen's Chamber shaft with his robot, helped install modern ventilation systems into the shaft, using the space that Caviglia dug around the bottom of the northern shaft to house an air conditioning system. During his work, he found that the shaft had again become somewhat clogged with debris, so Edgar's earlier efforts, while seeming to help somewhat, didn't totally stop the ingress of dirt and stone. What follows in this portion of Keith Hamilton's document is a series of pictures regarding the so-called Man-Killer Tunnel, which was another excavation that Caviglia dug around the uppermost portions of the King's Chamber northern shaft, where it meets the surface of the Great Pyramid. I have a full video on this Man-Killer shaft, which I'll link in the video description below if you are interested. Regarding the construction of the shafts, as with the Queen's Chamber shaft, there are some blocks within the King's Chamber shaft where the masonry is unfinished and rough. The most notable of these is block 23 in the northern shaft, which is incredibly long at 4.37 meters and has a partially unfinished ceiling. The reasons for this are unknown. In the southern shaft, the one that now has a fan at its entrance, block 5 is unfinished, which resulted in a lower ceiling height and therefore it became an obstacle for Gantenbrink. He shared his thoughts on as to why these unfinished blocks exist.
This is an obvious example of inferior workmanship, what we refer to as a Monday morning block. Block number 5 was almost certainly inserted without authorization from the architect or master builder. The discovery of a number of such unfinished blocks in both upper shafts and in the lower southern shaft as well would seem to indicate that the shaft builders made up a separate working group. This group apparently lagged behind at times, pressured by the rapid rate of growth of the pyramid layers and the construction of the chambers. This would also explain the extreme angle fluctuations in the vicinity of the King's Chamber.
Another unusual feature Gantenbrink noticed was the presence of a vertical joint between blocks 15 and 16 of the King's Chamber southern shaft, on which he would state,
"It is a complete anomaly to find vertical joint fully isolated in the nucleus of the pyramid, since it requires much greater effort to shape and fit the blocks into such an arrangement. We can assume that the builders must have had significant structural justification for going to the trouble of deflecting forces into the horizontal plane."
Why does this vertical joint exist? Why is there a need to deflect the forces in this way at this particular point within the pyramid? Are we missing something? Does this area contain some sort of structure or chamber? It would certainly be a strange thing to include at this point. Also in the King's Chamber shafts, Gantenbrink discovered a series of niches. These are best explained via the diagram currently shown on screen. A Professor Stadelman would suggest that these niches once held a door of some kind, which is an interesting theory. I'm not entirely sure of the purpose of this door. Perhaps it was to help stop rubbish falling down the shaft. I don't know. We can see these niches in the southern shaft only. They may have been present in the northern shaft, but they would have been potentially present on the blocks that Caviglia excavated around, so if indeed they were there, they have now been destroyed. From one of Gantenbrink's diagrams on screen here, we can see that the King's Chamber shafts exit the pyramid at the same level north and south. This brings us back to the purpose of the shafts and the unanswerable question that currently is. We turn our attention finally then to the last part of the pyramid we need to explore before winding up this video. Of course, it is the so-called relieving chambers above the King's chamber. We spoke briefly of Davidson's chamber, the first of these chambers, a short while ago, but let's take a better look at the full construction. The relieving chambers. The relieving chambers are named so, but it is not expressly thought that these chambers are for relieving purposes. The data on them is very irregular and unreliable, and as we can see from the diagrams presented in Keith's guide, the beams are incredibly irregular and bizarrely laid out. The topmost series of beams, I suppose what we could call the roof, is very similar to that of the Queen's Chamber in its design. Hamilton reminds us that the main focus of these chambers is the hieroglyphs that were discovered by Howard Weiss. There are those who think that these hieroglyphs were forged, but I don't know. Even for Weiss and Caviglia's time, that would be a bold move. As we just mentioned, however, the term relieving chamber doesn't really seem to fit. Hamilton explains that the chambers don't appear to relieve anything, and their only purpose seems to be to make the actual ceiling higher up into the pyramid masonry. There is a suggestion that the design is to push the huge roof away from the grand gallery, but this doesn't hold too much water when the Queen's Chamber was designed with a similar roof, only not so elevated. For its location and no doubt difficulty in constructing a structure filled with, as Hamilton states, vast quantities of heavy granite, there must have been a good reason for the builders to go through all of this effort. But what was it? Some have likened the 5 courses of ceiling spaces to the 5 courses of granite that make up the King's Chamber walls, and attribute some sort of symbolic meaning to the chambers. Others, like Petrie, have studied the chambers in more depth, but the knowledge on these constructions is still very limited. For instance, Petrie talks of 2 huge immense limestone walls at the east and west ends that are, quote, wholly outside of and independent of all the granite floors and supporting blocks, end quote. Why would they build the chambers in such a bizarre fashion? There is a suggestion that the builders simply perhaps ran out of granite. Petrie reports many cracks throughout the various levels of supporting blocks. One does wonder then if the chambers above the King's Chamber were originally designed this way, or if there was a change in plans due to the earthquake, or perhaps even a shortage of materials. It is possible that we may never know. Closing thoughts. Hamilton closed his guide much in the way that he opened it, lamenting the frustration around studying it due to the lack of or age of the supplied information on the structure, the fact that this video is 2 hours long and part 1 itself was also 3/4 of an hour in length shows that there is no shortage of information available on the Great Pyramid, but it is the quality of that information that lacks. Keith quotes Rudolf Gantenbrink, who said, "I just couldn't get over that we can fly to the moon and explore the depths of the oceans, but we can't answer so many basic technical questions about the most exhaustively studied historical monument of all times." As for Hamilton himself, he closes with a few interesting notes. First, that he believes that the pyramid was a unified build from day one and was never revised or expanded on. What you see is what you get, as it were. He also writes that he believed a boat to once be present in the Grand Gallery, although he quickly admits that he has no evidence to support this. We will touch on the importance of boats in Egyptian mythology and religion in future videos. For now, let's close the book on Keith Hamilton's Layman's Guide to the Great Pyramid, Part 2. This 2-part series on the Great Pyramid's properties and construction has been an exhausting effort, even with the outstanding guidance of Keith Hamilton and his Layman's Guide. I just want to say in wrapping up that these guides are essential for those interested in the facts about the pyramids of Egypt. I will implore you all one last time to please download and read Hamilton's work. I simply cannot recommend the papers enough to people who are interested in the pyramids. If you are still with me at this point, I want to extend a heartfelt thanks for watching or listening and for your continued support of my small channel. It really does mean the world, and your time spent here with me does make all the difference to the channel. I appreciate this has been a long video, but I wanted to keep the number of parts the same as the number of layman's guides that Keith had written on the Great Pyramid. I would also like to quickly thank my friends Tom and Gareth for their assistance with the extra narration provided on this video. Please consider liking and subscribing for further ancient Egyptian content. As always, I welcome any and all civil discussion in the comments below, but please do try to be nice to each other. That's all I ask. Well, that's it from me for now. Take it easy, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.